Number 1.
Employment Relations Statutory Minimum Redundancy Entitlements Amendment Bill, first reading.
Call Darian Fenton.
I move that the Employment Relations Statutory Minimum Redundancy Entitlements Bill be now read a first time. Mr Speaker, it's a privilege to introduce the first reading of this bill, and at the appropriate time I intend to move that the bill be considered by the Transport and Industrial Relations Select Committee. Mr Speaker, in the last year, 60,000 workers have lost their jobs, and for each of those workers, this is a personal tragedy. Every one of them has faced the awful impact and humiliation that redundancy has on them and their families. How they cope will differ. Those who are union members, by and large, will be better off because most of them are likely to have some kind of redundancy protection in their agreements. But thousands of others, like warehouse supervisor Rod Highstead, who's worked for his company 20 years until he was made redundant this week, has been go out of their jobs with absolutely nothing. An estimated 80% of working New Zealanders have no redundancy protections written into their employment agreement. For these New Zealanders, losing their job can mean that they have no way to pay their mortgage or support themselves and their families while they search for another job. This is because there are no requirements in New Zealand law for minimum redundancy notice and compensation. Mr Speaker, the need for a fair system of redundancy protection has become more urgent over the past 18 months as more people lose their jobs and replacement jobs are harder to find. I've been hearing from laid-off workers who have no redundancy notice and pay that's left them struggling to pay their mortgages and to support their families, and I have no doubt that other members in this House have heard the same stories. This bill would provide all working New Zealanders with basic redundancy protection to help tide them over between jobs. It's based on recommendations from the 2008 report of the Public Advisory Group on Restructuring and Redundancy, who advised the then government to consider introducing minimum redundancy protections for all workers. This group was established by Labor in 2007 to examine the adequacy of redundancy laws and provisions in New Zealand workplaces. The group was an independent body established to provide advice to the government and included representatives from the New Zealand Council of Trade Unions and Business New Zealand. The advisory group recommended options for addressing the gaps in and issues with existing law and policy provisions. The first recommendation of the advisory group was that the government should consider the introduction of a statutory requirement for redundancy compensation and other entitlements incorporating the following features: notice of redundancy termination to the affected worker, compensation based on length of service, a maximum level of statutory compensation, and provision of redundancy support and active labour market mechanisms to affected workers and organisations. Unfortunately, the National Government Minister of Labour allowed this very extensive and well-researched report to languish on her desk for 12 months, and then she threw it in the rubbish bin. Mr Speaker, this bill amends the Employment Relations Act by inserting a new Part 6E entitled Statutory Minimum Redundancy Entitlements. The minimum entitlements for employees by this part apply to an employee who has been in a continuous employment relationship with an employer for more than one calendar year. Within 12 months, the Minister of Labour will be required to conduct a public education campaign to inform employers and employees of the minimum entitlements conferred by this Act and report to the House of Representatives within 6 months of the conclusion of that campaign as to its details, including an independent evaluation of its effectiveness. The minimum entitlements under the bill that employees would receive as a result of this new part would be notice of dismissal due to redundancy of no less than 4 weeks, and compensation for redundancy of 4 weeks remuneration for the first year of the employee's continuous employment with the employer, and further compensation for redundancy in the amount of 2 weeks remuneration for each subsequent full or partial year of the employer's continuous employment with the employer, up to a maximum of 26 weeks remuneration. Mr Speaker, New Zealand workers are among the cheapest and easiest in the world to sack. We are nearly alone in the developed world, apart from the USA, in having no redundancy notice and compensation. That's right. Last year, the Australian federal government introduced generous redundancy entitlements because they are serious about protecting working families through the recession. We keep talking about wanting to catch up with Australia, but the government seems unwilling to take notice of any of the good ideas, and haven't we heard some of them today? Take the hundreds of skilled New Zealand engineers who were dumped from their jobs with Australasian company Transfield with no redundancy pay. Transfield said we don't have to give them any redundancy pay because there's nothing in law and nothing in the agreement. But funnily enough, if these workers had been in Australia, Transfield would have been required by law to pay at least the compensation proposed in my bill. It just doesn't make sense to me that a company can treat their workers one way in their home country and differently in another country. But unfortunately, they do. Because they can, that's right. Mr Speaker, this issue isn't just some abstract notion that I've dreamed up. And I know that you yourself, Mr Speaker, have been involved in this issue in the past as a Member of Parliament. I've advocated for workers who've had redundancy compensation and those who don't. And I've seen firsthand how devastating redundancy is and how devastating it can be for those workers who get laid off with nothing. I've also been made redundant. My husband's been made redundant twice. And I've also had to make some of my own staff redundant when I was an employer. So I have a good idea about what it feels like from all sides. Redundancy pay, of course, doesn't make up for the loss of a job, but the important thing is not just the process, but being left with a feeling of dignity and respect. Very, very important. Being laid off without notice and redundancy compensation is shocking. Not only does your job disappear, leaving you feeling like, without any sort of feelings of self-worth, but there are still bills to pay, kids to feed, and the huge uncertainty of whether you can find another job, and particularly in the current market. So, Mr Speaker, this bill is about giving families some breathing space, some time to pay the bills while they have that breathing space, and some time to find other work. Redundancy can happen to anyone. This isn't an issue for low-paid workers or higher-paid workers. It can happen across the board. We are talking about workers in all categories of occupations, from low-paid, as I said, and vulnerable, to the highly skilled. Just this week, I've had an email from a worker who said to me, I work in IT, and I was made redundant due to the economic downturn. The employment contract I had did not have any redundancy clause in it. I was told this news 2 weeks before the Christmas break. Looking for work over that time was next to impossible. Now, Mr Speaker, after 4 months, this worker does have a new job, but she's now earning less than 1/3 of what she used to. She lost her house and all of her savings. Now, we also know that layoffs happen to well-paid workers too, but normally they get suitcases of money. Let's have a look at former Telecom CEO Teresa Gatting. She got $1.8 million in a golden handshake, $1.8 million. And Evan Davies, when he left Sky City, got $1.77. And David Holsworth from Hellaby Holdings got $500,000. And Craig Norgett left Fonterra with around $1.5 million. So if it's good enough for them, I don't think the very modest provisions in this bill is too much to ask after years of service. Well, that's right. MPs, of course, get 3 months and other things. Mr Speaker, this bill should go to Select Committee for a proper discussion and consideration. We need to front up to the question about whether it's fair that Kiwi workers are being laid off through no fault of their own, with no basic financial protection to tide them over in the hard times between jobs. Now, this afternoon, the Minister of Labour cried crocodile tears when I asked her some questions and gave her examples of the terrible circumstances of real New Zealand workers. She said redundancy is never easy. That's true, but so far she and her government have done nothing about it. Well, today, Mr Speaker, they have a chance to ensure that there is a fair deal in hard times for Kiwi workers. I'm urging the government to do the right thing today by Kiwi workers by supporting my bill to Select Committee.
Question is to the motion.